Hey Joe, hope you're doing well, man. I'm so excited. It's been 7 months, 8 months, and I'm still excited every time I pick it up. I mean, really, honestly and truly. So, Renaissance Lute, 8 course, 8 courses. Um, this is a Tumiati lute, Giuseppe Tumiati. He's in, I believe, I hope I didn't get this wrong. He's in Pavia, Italy. He's definitely in Italy. And man, oh man, this is an exciting instrument. It is so exciting. If I sit here and I talk, first of all, it weighs about 8 ounces. I mean, it might be outweighed by a can of Coke. I don't know, but it's incredibly light. It's incredibly light. It feels almost like it's made out of paper. That's how thin it is. And the faces of these instruments are measured in millimeters, usually less than 2. So 1 point something, I don't even know. But man, oh man. I have to tell you just a little bit about the saga of getting into this thing. So I'm going to do that. I hope you don't mind. Um, as you know, I've been playing oud for 21 years now. 21. 22 years. 22 years now. Just starting. 22 years. When I was a kid, though, when you and I were hanging out, uh, I was going to the record store at the mall and getting cassette tapes of Renaissance lute music. I liked classical guitar. I liked that Spanish guitar, classical guitar stuff. And my brother played guitar, and he taught me about classical guitar. He explained to me the difference, and he used to play classical gas on his guitar. So I knew the guitar, and I liked the guitar. And then, of course, when you stumble over a record or a cassette tape of lute music at the store, you see this instrument, and you think, okay, that's funky. What is that? And I mean, I don't know. I was 12, 13 the first time I heard that music, and got a cassette tape of it, was listening to it. By the time I was in high school, I was listening to this lute music. And to me, it was like classical guitar music. And I thought it was cool. So I never thought, I'm going to pick this instrument up. I'm going to learn to play it. Probably there wasn't a single lute anywhere in the state at that time. And there might have been maybe 20 in the whole country. I don't know. I don't really know. The 1980s, okay? Long time ago. So there's that. And I just enjoyed it. I just thought it was interesting. Years and years later, I'm in Jerusalem with Becky, my wife, and I hear the oud for the first time. This guy named Muhammad, and that's a whole story. I'll tell you about that later. But here I was in Jerusalem, and to me, when I heard the oud, I thought, oh, well, this is a lute, but it's a lute without frets. Wow, you know. So I was hearing something totally new and totally different, but physically the shape of the instrument was similar to the lute, and it even had this delicate tracery, what they call the rose in the lute world, and what they call the warda, or the rosette, in the oud world. So I bought an oud, and the reasons why I bought the oud were complicated. But in that mix, a small percentage of the reason was, hey, now I finally have a chance to own a lute. Now, the thing is that if you get into the oud and you learn the oud and you discover Arabic music, if you have any kind of musical sensibility at all, Arabic music quickly captures your attention and persuades you and seduces you into its idiom, the idiom of Arabic music. It's a world. It's a universe unto its own, and it's fantastic. And that's what happened to me. I forgot about the lute, and I forgot about what we might call the lute connection. Okay, so I start playing the oud, and I get into writing for the oud, recording with the oud, verse music, which I've told you about. And then I got into writing for symphonies, like I told you. And the oud was in there, in that mix all that time. I was playing it. Sometimes I was doing so much composition that I wasn't playing it much. There were a few years there I didn't play the oud much. But I eventually got back to the oud, and I play it all the time. I mean, it's my main instrument now. But as you go on with the oud, after a while, you get deep into the history, and you hear things like, the oud was brought to Europe by the Arabs, and then it developed gradually into the European lute. And so at one point, the Europeans were playing something very close to Arabic music on an instrument that was very close to the Arabic oud, right? So you understand what I'm saying. This is not a instrument that originated in Europe. The lute is the European oud. It's not the other way around. The oud is not the European lute. The oud is not the Arabic lute. The lute is the European oud, right? So that was my mentality when the inheritance came through last year. And I thought, hey, man, here I am. And through this whole time, the early music scene, the early music movement has been gradually building up. I mean, it's like the early music scene is like it's like the pond in somebody's backyard. And when you go there when you're a little kid, it's mostly dry. There's just a little puddle at the far end, and you don't think much about it. And then you go back a few years later, and it's half full. And then you go back, last year, and it's full, and it's stocked, and everything looks beautiful. I mean, the early music movement has been growing throughout our lives, and now it's reaching this sort of critical point where it really is kind of coming up against the borders of mainstream music. I mean, Sting recorded a whole album with the lute a few years ago. It's in films all the time. Any kind of period film that deals with that era, you're going to see the lute. The lute is up and coming, and it's this extraordinary thing. It's been revived. It's been brought back from the dead. I mean, how many instruments does that happen to? Maybe that's going to happen to a lot of instruments. Certainly, the lute has to be included with the other instruments of the early music movement. All of the wind instruments, the Baroque flute, all of the viols, the harpsichords, the keyboard instruments, all that stuff. But to me, no bias at all, to me, the lute is instrumentally the absolute star of the early music movement. There is no instrument in the early music movement, in my estimation, that has more appeal, more currency, or more of a following. There are lute makers all over the world. There are lute makers. There are people making virtually exact replicas of Renaissance lutes in Japan, in China, South America. I mean, never mind the U.S. It's global, and there are thousands of players, and they're all over YouTube. So, beginning of 2022, I had these funds. I had some discretionary funds, and I thought, wow, I could get a lute. I could get into this. I mean, I'm an oud player, but I could get into the lute a little bit. I mean, how hard can it be? It's an oud with frets. No big deal, right? So my plan was get a cheap factory-made jobber. So I started looking around, and the bottom end stuff. There's a company. I'm not going to name names, but there's a company in Turkey, and they make ouds with frets, and you can tell that it is a modern oud with a wide neck put on it, and then frets, and it looks terrible. After you do a couple comparison shots, you look at the cheap lute, and then you look at an actual lute, a replica or a reconstruction or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, that's not the same at all. So I thought, well, yeah, I want to get a cheap one because I don't want to dedicate my life to this thing. I already know what I play. But I want to get a decent cheap one. I want to get a decent factory made one. So what are the good ones? Well, I pretty quickly found out that the really good factory made lutes are by a company called Lute Doré, and they're in France. And this Lute Doré company, they are like what would be the comparison? I mean, they are committed to reviving the lute. I mean, they don't just sell factory instruments that are at a high quality and high workmanship. They sell the music. They have resources. They have methods. They've published sheet music. I mean, the whole thing. It's a whole thing. Lute Doré. It's really a fantastic company. So I thought, okay. And I saw this guitarist on YouTube who had bought a Lute Doré lute, and it looked fantastic. And I thought, okay, great, Lute Doré. I'll get one of those. And they're expensive. I mean, they're comparable with a cheap, with a let's call it a budget used handmade lute. It's the same price range. Okay, so I looked them up, and guess what? You can't buy Lute Doré lutes anywhere. At least maybe it's changed now, but at the time, a year ago, January, a year ago, they were not for sale anywhere because there was a lawsuit. Somebody had pirated their lute and was now selling it out of China and making a killing, apparently. So Lute Doré sued them. So Lute Doré had no lutes available at all on their website. And they sort of, they were saying, don't buy these copies because they're pirating us. They're ripping us off. And that the whole thing is just kind of a little bit off-putting. It's like, well, I don't want to buy a Lute Doré lute and then be accused of contributing to something, Gosh, and I don't really want to get now that I've made the commitment to get an expensive factory deal. I don't want to go back and buy a cheaper one now because that's a step down. And as I was pursuing this thing, I was watching videos, reading articles, going online. I joined a couple pages on Facebook and started asking around. And the more you get into it, you know how it is with almost any kind of music, the more you get into a field, an instrument, a particular genre, the more appealing the whole thing becomes. So my desire was growing, and my interest and my familiarity was growing. And, about the time I realized I wasn't going to be able to get a Lute Doré lute, I also realized, maybe I really am willing to spring for an actual handmade lute. Used. I'll get a used one. So I started looking around, and I found some. And also I found out about people who said they were getting scammed. And I found out about people who said, be really careful, look for this, watch out for this when you're buying an instrument. And I made some contacts. I found some instruments that looked good, and I contacted the people. Some of the people never even got back to me at all. Some of them took a couple of weeks. Some of them got back to me within hours. And they might be in Europe, on a different continent. And so then I'm contemplating, okay, I'm going to spend a lot of money on the basis of a thumbnail and an email address. And I'm going to send this money to this person and hope they're not going to scam me. Yikes. And why are they selling the lute? Is it because, they're getting out of the lute and it's absolutely perfect and they just don't have the patience for it anymore or whatever? Maybe. Or maybe they want a better instrument. Okay, well, what's wrong with that one? Yikes. Lots of questions. So then I started to think, okay, these used lutes, and by the way, the price range for the used lutes, that was a whole other spectrum, from down into the range of the better factory made instruments, all the way up to new price. I mean, if you have a good lute by a name maker, a good maker, then it doesn't necessarily lose any value at all, And from what I could see from the market, the lute market wasn't hurting. I mean, these people were asking and apparently getting money for their instruments. So, okay, what does it take to get a new one? Because isn't that what everybody wants, right? It's this is a scope creep situation here. So I started contacting some makers, and I found this maker. Well, I have a lute for sale, and it's on my website. You can look at it. Okay. Well, it's been for sale since 2018. Okay. What's wrong with it? I don't know. So here's this maker. Good price. Looks like great instruments. Okay. Can you make a lute for me? Yeah. The wait is 15 months. Ugh. I don't want to wait 15 months to get started, you know. Just by accident, I found a maker online who actually he contacted me, and he said, we make lutes, and I could get a lute for you in I could have a lute made for you in 6 or 7 months. Wow. Okay, that's very exciting. So I did that. But that became the Baroque lute, which I'm going to show you in another video. But I thought after I did that deal and made the down payment on that, I thought, you know, I don't want to wait 7 months to get started. You know, I want to have something to get me going on the instrument, so that when I get that beautiful new one, I'll already have some facility and I'll be able to play it. That'll be exciting. Yeah. So let's just get a cheap one or a smaller one to tide me over until I get that one. And I wound up commissioning a Baroque lute. And so I thought, well, the Baroque lutes are more expensive than the Renaissance lutes. And so the technique is the same, right? I mean, it's basically the same thing, more strings, but otherwise it's the same. I'll get a Ren lute, get the technique down, and then I'll have a Baroque lute. Then I can do both. Oh, wow, very exciting. Doesn't work that way. This was a mistake. The first mistake was lutes and ouds are basically the same. No. The second mistake was Baroque lutes and Renaissance lutes are basically the same. No. The technique is different. The rep is different. And really it's like a different club, right? Like it's a different building on campus. It's not in the same department. Does that make sense? Okay. So Renaissance lute. And you know, as I'm waiting and waiting, my enthusiasm, my desire for all of these things is just going up and up and up. And I finally get in touch with 4 makers, well, two makers and 2 people that had lutes that were ready for sale. But I got in touch with this guy, Tumiati, and actually he got in touch with me and he said, I'm building a lute right now, and I could have it ready for you in a month. If you're willing to wait a month, I could have an instrument for you. And that really is, I mean, that's just a stroke of luck, because normally there's a waiting list, there's a backlog, you have to wait a year or more, and they don't have them ready on short notice, but he did. But it wasn't cheap, you know, good, fast, cheap, choose 2, right? So I thought, okay, take a deep breath, send the down payment. Okay, Giuseppe. And he sent me a message and he said, thank you for your trust. And great. So then I didn't hear anything for weeks, you know. And then I said, hey, Giuseppe, do you have any pictures? Yes, here's some pictures. And there'd been some progress, but not a lot of progress. And a month passed, a month and a half, 2 months. Okay. Hey, Giuseppe, do you have any pictures for me? How's it coming with the lute? You know, he says, it's coming. I've been very busy. You know, here's some more pictures. I thought, okay. He's responding to me, you know. So he's not trying to scam me. And, okay, the pictures, he's made progress. Okay, so, yeah. We're still a go here. Now we're 3 months, 3.5 months. Hey, Giuseppe, where are we at with the lute? Do you have any pictures? He said, it's done, and I'm ready to send it to you. Just send me the final payment. Okay, final payment. All right. Yeah, now the money's on the line. So I send the balance of the payment. I think the down payment was 20%, 25%. I sent the rest, plus the money for the case, plus shipping, and then I waited, and he sent me a tracking number, and then the instrument showed up, and it was in perfect condition, and I tuned it up, and it sounded fantastic. So this is it. This is an 8-course Matteo Celis. It's based on a Matteo Celis. Matteo Celis was making lutes around 1600. To my knowledge, there is not an 8-course surviving lute by Matteo Celis. This is actually based on an arch lute that had many, many more strings than this. But most of these arch lutes were converted from instruments that had fewer strings. So it's not at all implausible or unreasonable that he made 8-course lutes. And if he had made 8-course lutes, they would have looked like this. So I'm going to just hold it up to the camera so you can see some of this workmanship, because it's really amazing. And you can see there the rosette. See how it's relief carved? It's carved directly into the soundboard. That's not an insert at all. Soundboard is a single piece. Okay? And you maybe can't see, but the soundboard is slightly dished. The soundboard is very slightly concave. And then when you look at the neck, in oud terms, the neck is bowed. It's less than 90 degrees from the plane of the soundboard. This concerned me, but that's actually normal for lutes. And in fact, the camber, or the angle of the neck, fits the dish of the face, and this dished face gives you a little bit more room for playing with your fingers. And all of this is actually as it should be, which was good news. I tuned it up, I started playing it. There are no buzzes, there are no issues, the frets fit great. I've been playing on them for 8 months now, and they're as tight as they ever were, which is fantastic. You can see the peg box here. 15 strings, 1 single course, 7 double courses. Peg box is plain, but very well made. The pegs are way too small for my tastes. I'm used to oud pegs that are nice and easy to turn. These people, these Renaissance Europeans, they were smaller than me. They had smaller hands. But you know, if there were pegs that were the size I would prefer, then they wouldn't fit with the prototype. So you know, you adjust to the instrument. I mean, because there is a restorational mandate that runs through the lute world. We're not just making instruments that look and sound like we want them to. We're restoring something that was. We're bringing it back to life. On the back, the back of it, and I've never heard of another lute that was made from this, but that's what's called curly maple. It's a figured wood, and it's kind of it's just a slight uneven coloration that is considered desirable, and it's kind of hard to see, but if you saw it in person, it's really beautiful. It's really nice. The finish is really nice. Everything about this thing, it just works. It's got great sustain. It's loud. I can play subtly on it, although I'm very much at the beginning of all of this. But this experience dealing with Giuseppe Tumiati, the Tumiati lute, was a 100% positive experience. I recommend Tumiati lutes. If you want a Renaissance lute, well, if you want any kind of lute, Tumiati is a great maker to go to. Then later I got the lute number 2, which was the original lute that I had commissioned from the Dodds. And that's another great company. And I'll tell you about that in another video. But the 2 companies that I have personal experience with both make excellent instruments. And so I was just completely happy with this instrument. The piece that I played you at the beginning is a ricercare by Francesco da Milano. And Francesco da Milano is like the way that I think of him is he's like the Mozart of the Renaissance lute. His pieces are not the most technically demanding, but they're among the most beautiful, the most perfectly crafted, and the most beloved. There are people that have denser counterpoint longer compositions, more complicated ideas, but for sheer charm and fineness of composition, it's really hard to beat Milano. Milano was magnificent. He was personal lutenist to, I think, 3 different popes, worked in Rome, was in Rome when Rome was sacked by Charles V in the early 1500s. So had to flee, and had, I think, probably a very interesting life, but we don't know much about him. But there are more compositions by Milano than any other Renaissance lute composer published. And when we talk about published lute compositions, this is the beginning of printed published music. This is the beginning of that whole deal. And the lute, there were more lute pieces published and printed than any other kind of music in the Renaissance. Very exciting stuff. Very exciting. Hard to describe. Hard to communicate it. When you get a hold of it and you realize what it is, it's just it's awesome. And I sort of had these goalposts in my head. You and I went to college together, and we learned. I think you're with me on this. We were sort of given to understand that music really began in the Baroque era. Right? I mean, that was the first point where people were writing music that now we're playing. Right? So Bach, Vivaldi, Handel, all those guys, Baroque, great, okay. So this is our window. This is when our thing began. And before that, you have these curiosities from the Renaissance, and then back into the medieval era, and then it just sort of vanishes into the mists of time from that point. So here's how I can explain this to you. The goalposts for me have moved now. The music of the Renaissance, and most particularly the lute music of the Renaissance, these are not waypoints on the way to the beginning of the Baroque era. The window has opened now, and it's moved back into the medieval time period. And I think that's what defines you if you're an early music person. That's what that means. It means that you have embraced this music, and there's been enough scholarship now, particularly with the lute. There's been enough scholarship that the way these people play it's based on documents. It's based on treatises and method books that say this is how you play the lute, and it's based on music. It's based on music. I mean, when you learn Italian Renaissance lute music, you learn Italian Renaissance tablature. And there it is. There it is. And so they use numbers for notes, they use lines for strings, and there's even fingering indications. And based on other things, we have an idea of even what the tempos were. And it's not precise. It's kind of like Baroque music. We don't have precise exact BPMs and intonations and all of that, but we're pretty close. And it's amazing music. If you go online right now and you pull up a Milano lute solo and listen to it, man, I'm telling you, you could play that to anybody. You could play that at a dinner party. You could put on a concert. People will listen to it, and they'll fall in love with it. And that's the thing, man. This is great music. And I really do feel that there is a kind of reckoning. We're getting to the point where there's going to have to be a reckoning. And by that, I mean this group of composers that at one point were put in the curiosities box. They have to be taken out of that box, and they have to be put now on the same table with all of the great musicians, all of the great composers of history. Milano is the equal of any composer in the Baroque era, in my estimation, except of course probably for Bach. But even when you compare Milano with Bach, Milano doesn't come home looking shabby. This is great music. I can't go into it now, but it's great music, and it's an absolute adventure to pursue it and to begin to learn it on this instrument. So, man, way too long. I'm sorry about this. This is the Ren Lute, and I'm excited. This is my new instrument. I hope to become as proficient on this in my maturity as I became on the oud in the middle of my life. I don't want to lose the oud at all. They're going to have to learn to coexist. But I'm excited about this instrument. It's fantastic. So I'm hoping that the next time I see you, it will be with pictures of the Vasa. I hope you're going to shoot a video of that. Hope I get to see your adventures in Stockholm, etc., etc. Maybe a bit of Lulu at some point. Anyway, hope you're doing well, man, and have a great vacation, and we'll be in touch. Take care.